Hello, freaks, geeks, basement dwellers, and nerds. Welcome to the Nerd Zone. I'm Scruffy, and this is Scruffy Tales. And I figured I'm bored. I'm gonna make another video about ground war tactics in Star Trek. Sorry, I made one a couple of weeks ago talking about Romulan ground war tactics, and we're gonna be talking about Jem'Hadar, and they are essentially going to be the same. It's going to be based on the technology available in Star Trek. And where are we going to start off? Well, transporters. They have transporters. So just like Romulans, I'm thinking Jem'Hadar, everyone will be using transporters in combat for tactical maneuvering. So if you have an engagement between two squads or platoons or what have you, you can easily transport in reinforcements to deal with this engagement. You can transport in units a bit off to the flank so that they can move in and outflank the enemy, create that kill box, and force them to fall back. If you are overwhelmed and your troops are shit, we're in a bad position here, transport them out of combat and what have you. So transporters can be used for tactical maneuvering. And I'm willing to bet that the Jem'Hadar would use them to that advantage, that you have an engagement and then you can transport in another squad, platoon, what have you, to outflank the enemy and get into a more advantageous position without relying on running and what have you. The Jem'Hadar also have the cloak stealth capability that will allow them to have units further back when you're engaging. They can cloak, move up, and do that flanking move. Say if they can't rely on transporters, they can move cloaked and in stealthy fashion to get that flanking maneuver. And they can also use that, as we see in the show, for assaults, rushing into close combat. And we know that the Jem'Hadar rely on bayonets, and they have their bladed weapons as well, their pikes, spears, that they can use to push into close combat, being stealth and overwhelm the enemy in melee. Let's stick with transports. They would obviously use transporter bombs as well. If you know you have an enemy moving through an area, in Star Trek, you don't need to rely on artillery. You can instead transport explosive devices onto the enemy position. So if you are engaged and you call in fire support, your ships in orbit or your base behind the line will transport explosives onto the enemy position and annihilate them. You can transport bombs into midair and have air bursts just above them, or it's going to land right on top of the enemy in their midst and wipe them out. So transporters will be used as very highly effective artillery. Then the Jem'Hadar share a common trait with the Klingons: melee, close combat. And they prefer to push into close combat with the enemy, just like the Klingons. And I already made a video about this, my previous video, that this does make some sense. Because very few factions in Star Trek train to such an extent for hand-to-hand combat as the Jem'Hadar and the Klingons. So if you reach that situation where you are in a hand-to-hand combat situation, you have a massive advantage as a Jem'Hadar or Klingon. And we can see historical similarities. The Great Northern War, for instance, where you had the Swedish army that mainly trained for hand-to-hand combat with the bayonet and with rapiers instead of shooting with muskets at a distance. So what the Swedes would do would ignore firing until they were at 50 meters. So they would march through the enemy fire until 50 meters, fire a volley, and charge into close combat, and they would defeat enemies that outnumbered them 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 4 to 1, and so on. Highly effective, because they trained for close combat more than anyone else. And Sticking with the Swedish, it also happened in the Winter War of 1940. 90 Swedes went up against 600 Soviets. Big firefight, and at the end, the Swedes fixed bayonet and charged. The Swedes lost 10 of their own, and the Soviets were forced to flee, having lost 200 soldiers. Now, this was 1940 with machine guns, hand grenades, submachine guns, rifles, and what have you. So you can take inspiration from actual human history to justify Jem'Hadar relying on assaults and melee with bayonets and these pikes that they have. Because if you do suppress the enemy so the enemy can't open fire on you, you can transport into close combat, you can stealth your way into close combat, then you will have a huge advantage over troops that do not train as extensively as you do in hand-to-hand combat in melee. And I think this makes perfect sense for the Jem'Hadar, and it gives them a tremendous advantage on the battlefield. It gives them tactical options. You don't have to do it every time. The Klingons will more than likely every time push in for that hand-to-hand combat kill for the glory of it. But the Jem'Hadar will most likely use it as a tactical option depending on the situation. We also have multiple instances throughout Star Trek where you have dampening fields, either by because heroes and villains use dampening fields specifically to disable weapons, or there's some phenomenon that causes it to happen. So you can't rely on disruptors and phasers, and your only option is a bladed hand-to-hand combat weapon. So it is established that you can use technology to disable enemy weapons, energy weapons, and in that situation, having a glaive or a bat'leth makes perfect sense. I think it's completely justified that the Jem'Hadar have these weapons. And if they push in against Bajorans, Federation, even Romulans or Cardassians, it would give them a huge advantage in that fight. What else? Orbital strikes, obviously. I mean, if you do establish orbital superiority, you can target anything on the ground at will. Just blast away at the enemy ground forces as much as you want. And one thing that I think we should see more of, I talked about this, talking about the Romulans, but I do believe that the Jem'Hadar would use this as well. Transporter kills. You locate the enemy and lock on to them with transporters, and then just transport them out of combat and into space or high altitude so that they fall to their deaths if they're on a planet. Or you just transport them out into space where they die. Why engage them with phasers? Why engage them in hand-to-hand combat if you can just lock onto them with the transporters and just, fly them out into space essentially where they all die? So I think the Jem'Hadar would use transporters to move enemy combatants out of an area, out into space, and kill them that way, and then utilize conventional tactics and hand-to-hand combat when you can't reach an enemy with transporters, or there's too many enemies to be transported at any given time, or whatever the reason may be, right? I think that makes sense, right? Doesn't it? You would use transporters for that, to transport in bombs to kill the enemy, and use transporters to pull enemy soldiers out of combat and rematerialize in space or at a high altitude where they will die from exposure or from falling. That's what I would use transporters for at any rate. So I think all of this combined gives the Jem'Hadar massive advantages over, say, the Federation. Starfleet would not transport people into space, I feel. They don't have personal stealth equipment like the Jem'Hadar, and the Starfleet does not train for hand-to-hand combat to the same extent as the Jem'Hadar. So the Jem'Hadar, they're like a perfect mix of Romulan tactics and Klingon tactics. You have the mindset of the Romulans: do whatever it takes to win, utilize transporters to ensure you kill the enemy and win the combat. And they are also prepared for the extreme situations of pushing into hand-to-hand combat, just like the Klingons, where you can overcome the enemy in brutal, vicious, bloody melee, where the enemy is not as proficient as you are. So the Jem'Hadar, they are the most tactically flexible fighting force in Star Trek, I think. The Romulans can always push in remnants when it comes to hand-to-hand combat, but the remnants are more a specialized elite squad or a fighting force within the Romulan army. Klingons, everyone can fight in hand-to-hand combat, but they dislike ranged combat. Jem'Hadar, they train for ranged, medium, and close combat. And I think that makes them extremely versatile. They can utilize transporters to get bombs into position to transport enemies out into space when needed. They don't shy away from orbital strikes, and they can utilize stealth to outmaneuver the enemy and get in for hand-to-hand kills when needed. So I think that is what makes the Jem'Hadar such a massive threat in Star Trek. It what makes them this elite fighting force, that they combine the best of the Romulans with the best of the Klingons into a single fighting force, and that makes them deadly as hell. And I think it works. I think the basic concepts of the Jem'Hadar is realistic and fully functional, and it works in the Star Trek universe. I think basically almost everything about the Jem'Hadar is completely justified. So yeah, those are my thoughts about the Jem'Hadar. Hope you found it interesting, and that I'll see you in the next one. See you around.